So Dr. Simon Taylor is a mental performance consultant at the Canadian Sports Centre Atlantic. He holds a PhD in sports psychology from the University of Stirling, Scotland, where he investigated the impact of coach behaviors on athletes' fear of failure. His research interests are driven by his personal experiences of being a successful junior golfer who received an athletic scholarship to compete for a Division I university in the USA. So again, we're really excited to have Dr. Simon Taylor with us tonight and to learn more about his research in coach behavior. So I'll stop sharing and Simon, you can take it from here.
Thank you very much. There we go. Here we go. 1 second. Thank you very much, Kirsty. It is an honor to be here. I have to laugh because this is the first time I'm doing a presentation where I'm introduced as Dr. Simon Taylor, and it is a very surreal feeling because I just literally finished my PhD and passed everything, I think, about 2 weeks ago. So this is a very new and surreal feeling to be in this position. Imposter syndrome is definitely running at all times high. Yes, so my name is Simon, and I will be talking about some things I learned through my PhD. And I am a mental performance consultant with the Canada Sports Centre Atlantic. I'm also the owner of Tailored Mindset, a consultancy business that works with athletes and coaches here in Halifax. And I also do research at Dalhousie University here in Halifax. First things first, that is really important to me. I'm an athlete and I'm a researcher. You are all coaches. I am not going to pretend to know what it's like to be a coach. I'm not going to pretend to know that, like, just because I've researched coach behaviors that I know more about coaching than you do. That is not the case. You are the expert in your sport, and the last thing I want to do is tell you what you should say. My goal for this evening is to share some wisdom, share some knowledge based on the research that I've conducted over the past 5 years that align with my experiences as an athlete, as to in relation to some things that you might want to consider in your day-to-day coaching practices, whether that's in practice or in training sessions, or whether that might be in competitive environments. So I'm not going to tell you what to say, but just some food for thought on how we might phrase some things that can be overall ideally beneficial to the athlete, but also to you as a coach. Okay. I like having a connection with the audience. I like the audience to know about me. I don't want to just stand up here and be like, do this, this, and this, and this, and here's why. I want you to know where I'm coming from when I'm talking about the stuff that I'm talking about, because it's a huge passion of mine. I'm a golfer. Golf has been my life ever since I was able to walk. I was a successful junior golfer, and I'm referring to the successful because I got a large scholarship to go and play in the US at a Division I university in the NCAA. I thought I was going to turn pro. That was my dream, is be the next superstar in golf. And then I lost my scholarship after 2 years. So that dream was fairly short-lived. I was fortunate. I was able to transfer to a different school in the US where I was able to finish my studies. And that was that. That was the end of my golf career as a player, or those hopes and dreams of turning pro were basically, that was the end of them there. So after this kind of happened, after realizing I'm not good enough to turn pro, I was like, well, what am I going to do now? And so then I decided I want to figure out what happened. Why did my game go from being good enough to have a scholarship to all of a sudden I can't play golf to save my life and I'm struggling big times? Why? What's going on? And so then I decided to go and say, yep, let's torture myself some more and do some more further education. And so I went to Scotland, because my family's from there, to do a master's in sports psychology at the University of Stirling. And then I realized, you know what, 9 months, great, I've got a master's, but I still know nothing. So then I decided I want to investigate this a bit more and understand kind of what happened during my time as a college athlete. And so then I came across this topic of fear failure, and I wanted to investigate the coach-athlete relationship, and specifically in relation to fear failure. So that's that's how I got to where I am today. Am I upset that I didn't turn pro? Sure, but am I happy that I get to be here this evening talking to you about something I've been researching for way too long? Yes, arguably, I'm more happy to be in this position than I would be in another position playing, because now I get to try and help athletes and coaches in their day-to-day lives flourish. Yeah, so this is I'm very happy about how things turned out for me in the end. Okay, before we get started, I would love to know, there's a few people in the audience. I don't know any of you, sadly. I'm also just new to all of this. So I'd like to kind of know what sport you work within. So if you could like post that to your chat, please, just so I can kind of see what kind of like sport you coach in, because I'm going to be giving some examples. Ideally, I want to like kind of share a little bit what some coaching examples in different sports, and so I want to use some sports that I mentioned here: ringette, basketball, triathlon, soccer. Okay, I know soccer. That's good. I grew up in Germany, so soccer's good. Curling. I've been learning about curling. I've been watching the Winter Olympics, so I've been learning about curling. Okay, I will try and use basketball. I know a little bit from watching on YouTube. Yeah, I will try and use examples. Swimming, awesome. Rugby, awesome. Brilliant. Basketball, fantastic. So yeah, you are all, without a doubt, way more knowledgeable than I will ever be in your sport. So this is perfect. So I will, again, not say anything as to what you should be saying, but just providing some food for thought and to the kind of how we say certain things. Like Kirsty said, I'm going to go through the presentation, and then at the end we'll have time for questioning. But if there's ever like questions you want to ask throughout, just like, I suppose, just like post it in the chat, and then I'll either answer them later, or if it's a pressing question, maybe Kirsty might pause me and then just read it out loud. Okay, the first point that I would like to talk about today, that I learned throughout my career and my research career, is that it's less about what you know and more about the environment you create for your athletes. Now, some of you are sitting there probably going like, all right, I know this. Why have you done a PhD just to tell me this? And I'd like you to be patient and not leave, because I hope that as I progress throughout this presentation, there'll be some things that are maybe you've not heard of before. But generally, the idea is that like knowledge does not equate to being successful. There's more to being successful than just having theoretical knowledge, right? You can be the smartest person in the world, but it doesn't mean that all your athletes will like love you and look up to you and like want to learn from you, right? So there's more to it. There's more to coaching than just being knowledgeable. And I think the best way to describe that is look at social media or look at news right now in the world. What's going on in the world right now, right? It's not the smartest people that are always getting the most attention on our day-to-day news on social media platforms, right? The people that are getting the most attention are the ones that have like buy-in from individuals, or that like have connection to individuals, that connect to their followers, or like have buy-in from people. Yeah, so it's not necessarily the people with the most knowledge who are getting the most attention, but rather there's other factors going on there. And so if for some reason like everything cuts out now and this is the end of the presentation, the takeaway for now is that yes, knowledge is important, but there's more to it than that. We need to focus on kind of the environment that we create for the athletes. Now, I'm going to give two examples. They're not perfect by any means, but I'm going to try and paint a picture of like two examples of coaching environments with between the interactions with a coach and an athlete. And I've used boxing because I tried to use something other than golf, which is my sport. And we'll use this instance of, let's say, and again, if there's a boxing coach in here, I'm not a boxer, so please go easy on me if I use the wrong terminology. So we'll imagine that this is like round 3 or 4 in a boxing match, and your athlete's typically really good, really successful, like really strong, and you have high expectations because the athlete just like performs well all the time. all of a sudden your athlete's having an awful day, like just nothing's working, just making unforced errors after unforced errors, and just like getting beaten up by somebody who just shouldn't even be like in the same league as your athlete. Now the bell rings at the end of the round, the athlete sits down and the coach comes over, and like this image is just like the coach is just like angry and scary and just like yelling like really loud, and you're just like, the athlete's just sitting there just kind of going like, oh, okay. That's one example of coaching that I want to give you. Yeah, it's just this like this angry, loud, maybe hothead, just generally scary coach, right? Then we've got another example of like same scenario. You've got a great athlete, great boxer who's just having a nightmare of a day and just getting beaten up by somebody who's well beneath his level. And this coach, on the other hand, comes over and is just like calm and collected and just a bit more easygoing and just less yelling and more just like, okay, here we are. It's great that I found a black and white picture and a colorful picture, because I feel like that like kind of like paints the message home that I'm trying to like bring across here. And so these are the two types of coaches that we've got, okay? Same scenario, two different types of expressions of coaches. I don't want you to necessarily post in the chat, but I'm going to give you a minute to think about these two scenarios and which coach you prefer. And like, if you have a pen and paper, like feel free to write it down, and feel free to write down why you maybe prefer one coach or the other. But just, if you don't have a pen and paper, use this time to like get a pen and paper, because throughout this presentation, I'll be encouraging you to write down some thoughts. If you don't have a pen and paper, you can use your phone as well. So we've got these two different types of scenarios, two different types of coaches. One is angry and loud and hot-headed, and the other one's calm and collected. Which coach do you prefer? Yeah, keep that in mind. I'll just give you another few seconds to think about that before I move on. Okay, what I want you to do now, because I've given you, you've got a pen and paper, or you've got your phone, I would like you to create like a table. This is just for yourself, not going to share it with the group. We've only got like an hour, and so like if we're in person, I'd love to do all this stuff and chat and sit down and share thoughts and ideas and whatnot, and we'll do that at the end. But for now, I want you to do this just on your own, okay? So same situation, your sport, you know more about your sport than I do. So picture same situation. You've got an athlete that's typically a high performing athlete, and all of a sudden your athlete's just having a nightmare of a day and just making unnecessary mistakes. And you're just sitting there going, what's going on? This is not the way my athlete usually performs, okay? And I want you to write down some, like, in your ways, quote unquote, good and bad ways that you might respond to this athlete, okay? So write down some good, just bullet points is fine, and then some bad examples of how you might respond to your athlete. And I'm going to give you 2-3 minutes to think about this, because this is important. So you have an athlete that's struggling and just making really unnecessary mistakes and just like losing to the competition, even though like your athlete's just by far the most talented one. And you get a chance to chat with them during halftime, during a break, whatever it might look like in your sport. Write down some thoughts as to what you might say and what you consider good versus bad. It's going to give you like another minute just to think about some examples that I'm sure some of you've got some great examples in your mind where you can think of athletes of yours that have just made mistakes where you just like almost want to hold your head and go, oh, what is going on? So write down some good ways that you would respond, and then some bad ways that you would think of ways to respond. Give it like 20 more seconds. It's another great thing to be doing on Zoom when you're giving everyone time to write down thoughts. And you, like, if this was in person, I would be looking at you and being like, oh, you're still writing, but now it's on Zoom, you have no idea. So for those of you who've been done for a minute, I apologize. I just want to make sure everyone has enough time to give it some thought. Okay. By now, I assume most of you have written down a couple of thoughts, and if you haven't, I'm going to be scribing a homework, if you will, and then you can write down more as like a takeaway then, okay? But you've got down some thoughts, I hope, some 1 or 2 points at least for good versus bad, and then we can work with that. So, how do we define good versus bad, in quotation marks, coaching in sports psychology? We use a different term. We use what's called psychological needs when we talk about good versus bad. So for us, good versus bad is a lot more subjective than performance related, as in sports psychology. Now, has anyone heard of psychological needs before? Before I go on to just explain what they are. If you have, post it in the chat, and if you haven't, also just let me know. Who of you have heard of psychological needs? Lonnie says yes. Awesome. That makes me happy. And if you haven't heard of psychological needs, that is totally okay. We will be talking about them. Right, got a couple of you saying yes, you've heard of psychological needs. That is good. Yes, another one so far. Wow, almost don't need to be presenting if you've all heard of it already. Okay, so a few so far. All of you have heard of psychological needs. That is fantastic. And yeah, when we look at good versus bad coaching as like sports psychology researchers, we typically look at the environment that coaches create in relation to individuals' psychological needs. And so we would describe a good coach as somebody who satisfies their athlete's psychological needs, and we'd refer to a bad coach, quote unquote bad coach, as somebody who frustrates the athlete's psychological needs. And now I'm going to start getting into some of these psychological needs a bit more in depth, and I'm going to do my best to make sure I go through it nice and slowly. I've created a lot of slides, so I'm hoping there's be plenty of opportunity for us to talk about it in depth in a way that's not too rushed. If I'm too fast, please stop me. Just post in the chat and tell me to slow down or something. I've been reading and writing about this topic for 5 years, and I'm really passionate about it. So sometimes I get excited and kind of rush through things. I apologize. It is not my intention. So if I ever get too quick, just feel free to let me know. So the basics. Again, if we lose power or whatever, and this is the end of the conversation, there's something, the takeaway I want you to know is that every single individual has 3 psychological needs, okay? Number 1, and sorry, these 3 psychological needs are prevalent across age, across cultures, across the world, okay? Every human being has these 3 psychological needs. Number 1, the psychological need is called this need for autonomy. And what is autonomy? Autonomy is considered like psychological freedom. And that is a good way to kind of describe autonomy. It's just a psychological freedom. I am in control of what I think, what I feel, and what I do. That is basically autonomy, being autonomous in my own body. I choose what I want when I want. And this psychological need is satisfied if a coach lets me have this autonomy over my yeah. Okay, so that's number one. It's the need for autonomy. And again, if anyone has any questions about this, just like post in the chat. All right, but I think that one, I hope that makes sense to everybody, this idea of just being in control of your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. The next psychological need refers to this need for competence. So if we look at the environment we're in, right, again, like relating it back to, it's less about your knowledge and more about the environment you create. If we look at the individual's need for competence, if I'm an athlete, I want to feel like I'm effective in my environment. I want to feel like I can master whatever it is I'm going out to do. Like if I'm a rower, I want to row in a certain time. If I'm a boxer, I want to feel like I'm capable of winning this match. If I'm a golfer, I want to feel like I'm capable of shooting a certain score, whatever it might be. I want to feel like I can accomplish a set task. And that is this need for competence. If I feel like the environment I'm in allows me to feel capable of doing that, then my need for competence is satisfied. Finally, and this is arguably a very important one, is this need for relatedness. And this relatedness basically refers to, I want to be accepted by others. I have this need to be accepted by the people in my immediate environment. And when it's on the team, it's like coaches and athletes. I want to feel accepted by others. I want to care for those people in my environment, but I want them to care for me as well. Okay, so it's a mutual understanding. It's I care for my coach, but my coach cares for me too. So if we have a coach that, like, if you're a coach and you care for your athletes, chances are, and they feel cared for by you, chances are this need for relatedness is met. I've described these three needs as if they're separate things, but really they all kind of like interact with each other. They're all kind of related to each other in the sense that, like, it's hard to like satisfy one without the others being impacted at the same time. So we've got these three needs, and the goal is, the ideal is to like create an environment where these three needs are satisfied. And why is that important? Why is it important for you as a coach? Why am I telling you, coach, hey, it's less about knowledge and more about satisfying these psychological needs? Well, if you can satisfy their psychological needs, not only does it lead to well-being within your athletes, but it also leads to like optimal functioning, right? It leads to the athlete just being like able to perform in an optimal manner. On the other hand, if you do the opposite of satisfying your athlete's psychological needs, you frustrate them, that's what we refer to them as, that leads to what is called ill-being. So the opposite of well-being is ill-being, and that is bad. So if you frustrate these three psychological needs within your athletes, it leads to ill-being within your athletes, and that's not great. Okay. So before I move on, okay, I've just said ill-being and well-being and optimum functioning, and it's like, okay, cool, like well-being, yeah, cool, that's great and whatnot. Ill-being, yeah, not great, we don't really want that. But like, so what does the research actually say? What is research that's been published? Okay, because I kind of want you to go away not just being like, oh well, Simon said this is important, but I want to give you evidence to say here's why it's important. Okay, so if we look at coaches who satisfy their athletes' psychological needs, or sorry, if we look at these needs supportive coaches, so by needs, I'm referring to psychological needs, okay? So if we have a needs supportive coach, it leads to increase in athletes' psychological needs satisfaction, which is obviously to be expected if you're needs supportive, right? So that's good. It leads to well-being, cool. We're happy with well-being. We want happy athletes, right? It leads to, it's associated with self-determined motivation, which is a very important factor, right? If we think about motivation, we've got this idea of like, you might be intrinsically motivated, or I'm doing this because I have to. Like, what would you rather have? You'd rather have an athlete who's intrinsically motivated. And so a needs supportive coach can help athletes become more intrinsically motivated, which is something I'm sure all of you would love your athletes to have from the get-go. Not only is it associated with this ideal motivation, it's also associated with more persistence. So athletes can push through failure a bit more, push through like hard times a bit more, and willing to like persist even when things aren't going well. hugely important for like your athletes, right? How many times do you have to have an argument with your athletes going like, come on, you can do this, so that there's a light at the end of the tunnel and the athlete almost, sometimes you feel the athlete's like pulling away and you're like, oh, if only you just pushed a bit harder and like persisted for a bit longer. Guess what? Need supportive coaching can help with that kind of stuff. And what might arguably be the most important thing for you as coaches might be the performance, because so many factors depend on athletes' performance. So be a needs supportive coach, and it's associated with increased performance in athletes. So I hope that you're sitting here and looking at this table here, or these bullet points, and going, okay, I see this. Again, there's room for discussion at the end. If you disagree with me, I hope you'll speak out and be like, I think this sucks. I think what you're talking about is a lot of rubbish. I'm okay with that. It's fine. Like, honestly, I don't want you to just agree with me for the sake of agreeing. Like, I'm more than happy to have an argument if people disagree with me, okay? So now that we've looked at what the research in relation to needs supportive coaching is associated with, let's look at the opposite. So what about if you have a needs frustrating coach? Needs frustrating is oftentimes also referred to as controlling coaching, by the way. I like to say controlling coaching because it's less of a mouthful than having to say needs frustrating. Anyway, a controlling coach, the research shows that like those coaches who are more controlling, their athletes typically experience more needs frustration. So again, it's the opposite of satisfaction. It's you're frustrating their psychological needs. And having these psychological needs frustrated oftentimes leads to like non-self-determined motivation. That is a mouthful, non-self-determined motivation. So what, right? Just because my athlete's not intrinsically motivated, is that a problem? I don't know, maybe not. And it depends, I suppose. We all know athletes that are just there because, let's say, they're getting paid. Once you take the money away, the athlete disappears. Or the athletes that are part of like provincial programs, they're there because they're getting the support. But once that support dries up, the athletes are going to drop out and quit and do something else. That's non-self-determined motivation. So if we're frustrating athletes' psychological needs, they engage for reasons other than because they enjoy it. They'll engage because they feel like they have to. They'll engage. They'll participate because they're like, oh, if not, I'll just get shouted at. Whatever it might be. The meaning behind this part here, this non-self-determined motivation, means that athletes are maybe taking part in your sport for the wrong reasons, and that's a problem, especially long term. And then finally, a coach who's more needs frustrating, this has kind of been found to be associated with burnout in athletes. Again, burnout is a huge problem, especially nowadays within the pandemic over the last few years. So many of us have been heard about it, maybe been dealing with it personally, and it's a nightmare. Burnout is not fun. And a coach who's very controlling can kind of be can get athletes to experience burnout maybe quicker. And so the research is kind of definitely pointing towards the benefits of being a need supportive coach. Okay, what I want to do now is give some examples, right? I've spoken about these needs, I've spoken about the research, cool, but like, it's important for us to share some examples so we can kind of see maybe real life examples of what this looks like in action. Because yeah, anyway. What does okay, I'm getting rid of this. What does a coach who actively frustrates an athlete's need for autonomy look like? This type of coach is someone who intimidates the athlete, who like coerces their athletes to do certain things a certain way, or only rewards the athletes when they're succeeding. I'm sure reading that, and look, I'm not like, I've researched this, so I know that this can be really bad, but a lot of times, back in the day, I know, because I've spoken to coaches who've been in the business for like 30, 40, 50 years, and maybe some of you have been in the business for the same length. You might read some of these things and be like, what's wrong with this? Why is this a problem? Why is it a problem to only reward my athletes when they're succeeding? Well, it's a problem because you're frustrating their need for autonomy. And if we go back to the research, this research suggests that, like, look, frustrating these psychological needs leads to burnout, leads to dropout, leads to like the wrong kind of motivation. And if we're looking for athletes who want to participate in sport for a long time, behaving in these kind of ways can frustrate their need for autonomy, and that can be problematic. Intimidation, just like, you better do this or else, or my way or the highway, or you're not getting dinner tonight because you didn't play well enough. Those kinds of things. That is like a very autonomy frustrating type of coaching environment, or coach behavior, sorry, I should say. Let's look at competence. This need to feel capable of succeeding, right? A coach who just kind of like constantly like shows doubt about an athlete's ability to perform, whether or not it's true is beyond the point right now, okay? So you have an athlete that is in front of you, and you as a coach are just like, I don't think you're ever going to make it. Like, whether or not that's your belief is a different thing. We all have athletes that we've worked with where we're like, yeah, you're maybe in the wrong sport. And then it's maybe having a discussion about saying, I think you're in the wrong sport, but getting them back to train and compete. And every time you're around them being like, you're making a mistake. Yeah, this is wrong. You shouldn't be here. Or just like constantly highlighting mistakes, just doing nothing but saying that was bad, that wasn't good enough, this wasn't good enough, this should have been better, all those things. And then also like being like overly critical in public in front of others, that just kind of really actively frustrates this athlete's the athlete's need for competence. And then relatedness, I think that one's probably the most straightforward one for all of us to think about, like this need to feel cared for, but also care for others. If we frustrate that, that is just you being extremely hostile towards athletes. Like, don't come to training tomorrow. You didn't do good enough today. That's it. You're banned for a week. You're being punished because you didn't perform to a certain level. As you've seen on that example I've just given you, these three things go hand in hand. It's hard to like do one thing without like frustrate one need without the other need being frustrated somewhat as well, right? So like being hostile towards athletes, excluding them from activities, will probably also like frustrate their need for autonomy, right? If you say you're not welcome anymore because you didn't do well enough, well, the athlete doesn't have a choice in coming back, right? So it's not, these are three separate needs, but they're very much interrelated with each other. And so here's three examples of how coaches can kind of frustrate athletes' psychological needs. And again, that can be very problematic for the athletes. At the end, we're going to go over examples that are maybe, I'm going to let you share some examples that are maybe a bit more gray. I'm trying to paint a picture very black and white here, okay? Very bad versus good. And so by the end of this session, we can kind of recognize, okay, this is a clear way of how we can frustrate athletes' needs versus a clear way of how we can satisfy them. There's a lot of gray in between that we'll maybe get a chance to chat about a bit as well. So now that we've spoken about a brutal coach, let's talk about a coach who's a bit more need supportive. An autonomy supportive coach is a coach who provides options, who encourages their athletes to think and take part in the decision-making process. Or if you're like saying to your athletes, you know what, it's this way, I want you to do this because I say so. It's not just it's this because I say so, like my way or the highway. It's I want you to do this, but here's why, right? It's just going a little bit above and beyond instead of this is it, this is what we're doing, and that's the end of it. Just being like, hey, this is what we're doing, and here's why I think it's important. Or hey, this is what I want to do. I want you to develop in this area. What do you think? What are your thoughts? Are you happy with doing it this way, or would you maybe like to do it a different way? Just allowing there to be some ballpark for like discussion between you and the athlete, that the athlete maybe has options to choose from, like, do you want to do it this way, or do you maybe want to do it a different way? And if you want to do it a different way, why? Just like allowing there to be a discussion between you and the athlete, so the athlete has some say in what happens. It's not much more work on your behalf. It's just basically giving them an opportunity to be like, okay, this is what I want from you today. What are your thoughts? And that's it. That's how quickly you can go from being a more controlling coach to a more autonomy supportive coach. Competence, basically guiding an athlete in guiding an athlete in feeling capable of succeeding. or being able to overcome challenges. So just being like, hey, look, I think you can do this. I think you're quite capable of doing this. Or maybe, you know what, this is going to be a challenge. I think you might struggle with this, but I think you're able to do this, and here's why, for instance, right? So this here's why is like a combination of competence satisfaction and autonomy satisfaction. Yeah, again, I'm using very clear-cut examples, but I recognize there's a lot of in between here between frustration and supportiveness, and we're going to do like we're going to go over this stuff later where things might not be quite as clear-cut. How can you satisfy an athlete's need for relatedness? Really? It's on paper. Again, let me just pause there for a second. On paper, everything's simple. In practice, it's a lot harder, right? Everyone has the best intentions. And if everything was as easy as it looked like on paper, I wouldn't be talking about this because we'd all be doing it all the time, right? We all have the best intentions, but sometimes the best intentions don't necessarily lead to the best outcomes. Yeah. So how can we satisfy an athlete's need for relatedness? Well, one way is to just like show care. Like, again, show your athletes that you care about them beyond them being an athlete. It's not just, oh, you're here training, talk to me about training, and go home and I don't care anymore. Like, be like, hey, what do you like doing outside of, I don't know, swimming, rowing, volleyball, whatever? Like, what hobbies do you have? What are your interests beyond this? What are your goals within this sport? And then when the athletes like make a mistake, be empathetic towards them. Yeah, so I've given you kind of like really hopefully clear-cut examples of how we can be a bit more psychological needs supporting versus psychological needs frustrating. All right, what's next? Okay, now there's a small chance for someone to chat if someone feels comfortable. We've got the athlete, right? The athlete makes these unnecessary mistakes, the boxing one, and you get a chance to chat with them during halftime. How could you approach this situation and try and be a quote unquote good coach considering the athlete's psychological needs? So the example was the athlete's messed up big time and there's no need for the athlete to be messing up like this, but you get a chance to chat to the athlete. Using psychological needs, how could you be a good coach towards them and be like supportive, thinking of these needs here? Let's hear it. If you can either put it in the chat or you can put your microphone on and share it out loud with the group, whatever you feel most comfortable with. And you can also, sorry, you can also just be like, talk about a single need if you want. If you don't want to talk about the whole 3 needs together, you can talk about an individual need at a time. So yeah, like Kirsty said, feel free to unmute and share your thoughts or type in the text box.
Hey Simon, I've tried to use humor in the past, kind of lighten the experience a bit, and usually they respond positively to it.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much. I think that's a great idea. Using humor can just kind of like enhance that need for relatedness, right? Just like taking the power out of the athlete feels down, the athlete has just messed up and the athlete probably feels bad about it. Just using a bit of humor and just being like, hey, look, it's okay. Like, it's just trying to lighten the mood a bit. I think that's a great way to show care in your athletes. So that's a great way to like potentially enhance this need for relatedness. So yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Matt. That's a great example. What else we got for the other 2 needs? Anyone got any thoughts?
I think maybe identifying the elephant in the room. Yeah, that's not going so well. And then asking some probing questions like, what are you noticing that's happening? Or what did we practice? How would you like to feel? Or what would you like to do that you've done before?
Yeah, brilliant. I think that's fantastic. Thank you, Pat, for sharing that. I think that's a great way to kind of allow the athlete to kind of have a feeling of autonomy over the decision. Like, and I get it. I realize as I'm saying this, some of you might be thinking, well, what if the athlete doesn't know? That's a different story. That's a story for another day. Where I'm assuming that most of us coach athletes that have been in this sport for a while and kind of know their faults and what's kind of expected of them, technically speaking. So providing them an opportunity to be like, look, what, like, it's tough if you've only got 10 seconds, then it might be challenging to provide a sense of autonomy, right? But if you've got time to like talk to them and be like, hey, like, what's going on? Like, what do you think's going on? Like, based on your past experience where you've done well, what do you think you could do differently? And so that's basically killing two birds with one stone. You're saying, look, what do you think you could do differently? You're giving them an opportunity to like have satisfy their autonomy to choose, and based on past experience where they did well, using that experience. So I think that is a great way to kind of like satisfy these needs. All right, I'm seeing some people. Jeff, remind them to zoom out. That one play won't determine the result. Not sure of competence or relatedness. Again, I think depending on the way you say it, it can be both. Just be like, hey, look, it's okay. Like just have a take a look at, take a step back. I think that can be both competence and relatedness. And like one play doesn't determine the result. Yeah, just like take it easy. It's okay. I think that's great. Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Lonnie, competence. It's not going well, but I know you have the capable skill to turn us around. You can do this. Brilliant. Exactly. Right. It's actually, when we see it like that, when you put it like that, it's like, oh, that's actually quite straightforward, right? And yes, it can be quite straightforward at times, depending on the situation we're in. So brilliant, all of you. Thank you very much for sharing that. Now, what I want to do is something fun. I painted the picture of this guy is great. He's good, in quote unquote. So in other words, he seems to be a guy who's like satisfying his athlete's psychological needs. Now, let's flip it. How could this coach, who is like calm and collected, actually frustrate this athlete's needs? And this is a tough one. Like, have a stab if you want. And if you don't feel comfortable or you're not sure, that's okay. Totally up to you. I'll give you a minute to think about it. But looking at this situation, how do you think that this coach could actually, even though he's calm and collected, maybe actually really frustrate the athlete's psychological needs?
Maybe I would say not providing what the athlete needs at that given moment. Perhaps the coach not interpreting exactly what those needs are, and so the athlete is looking for something to have a better understanding of where to go next, but the coach is giving them this kind of general view, and so at this point there is frustration more than there is competence, right?
That is fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. That's exactly it. I think that's fantastic. Just like, oh yeah, everything's dandy, don't worry about it. And the athlete's like, look, I need Kirsty posted as well, someone said that the athlete's looking for a lifeline and the coach is just like, oh, everything's fine, don't worry about it. Like this like false, this like toxic positivity almost can actually, even though it's well-intentioned, can actually be really really like needs frustrating as well. Yeah, or look, you posted, you're not doing what I'm asking you to do. Yeah, the coach can be calm and collected, and which we would consider like desirable, but actually could be just be like, you're not doing what I want you to do, even though it's like said in a very calm way. So we might be saying it in a friendly way and a smiling way, but it can actually still be really needs frustrating. Yeah, so like if we picture this guy, like these two interacting, the coach seems friendly and like chatty and like bubbly almost and like nice. You could almost be just like, imagine him like in a funny tone, like laughing almost and being like, hey, like you're making a lot of mistakes out there, like just do exactly as I say and everything will be fine. Like, and then jokingly go on to be like, you know what though, if you keep this up, you're not getting any dinner tonight, and then laugh about it, right? So I've said that in a way that seems to be nice and calm and like supportive, but everything I've said here and I've highlighted it, like you're making a lot of mistakes out there, like with no follow-up. That is a competence frustration statement there, right? Just do exactly as I say and everything would be fine. That is me saying my way or the highway. And then just to top things off is in a joking way, which I am sure all of you have heard somebody say before, or you might have used to yourself in the past, because we thought it was kind of like a funny, like motivating statement. But this, like, you know what, keep this up and there's no food for you tonight. I've been told that as an athlete before, and I can tell you from personal experience, it's not fun to hear that, especially when things aren't going well. When you're struggling as an athlete and your coach says, like, you keep messing up and there's no food for you, that's tough. That's really tough to hear. So although this environment looks friendly and caring, and the stuff that I've just said I said it in like a nice enough way, this can actually be really, really like painful and like needs frustrating. Now, you might have an idea what's coming next. This guy seems angry and loud, maybe a bit scary. How could this coach actually be satisfying his athletes' needs in this situation? Like, he's shouting at the athletes and he's being loud about it and he might be angry, but is there a way that this coach could actually be satisfying his athletes' needs, regardless of his like temper, if you will?
I think so, because I think that when you have a relationship with a coach and athlete, I mean, everyone has it's a different way of you know, the way their body language is, their demeanor, the way they carry themselves. And I think if you as an athlete have been working with that particular coach, even in that moment where he looks intense, whatever, you can still find what you need to move you on to that next step, right?
Yeah.
The relationship is the biggest thing here, right?
Yeah.
So relatability, I guess, would be here for that, yeah.
Yeah, again, thank you. That is a brilliant example. I couldn't agree more with you. And I see that Margaret's posting in the chat. It's all about knowing your athlete. This athlete might need to be pumped up. Exactly. So the reason I wanted to give these two examples is because we typically assume, especially nowadays, that calm and collected is good and angry and loud is bad. That's not necessarily the case, right? You can be calm and collected and be awful to your athlete, and you can be loud and angry, but be actually really good for the athlete. So the example I've given here is just like this coach like shouting at his athlete, like, you know what you got to do to beat your opponent, just kind of like saying like, you know exactly what you've got to do, so just go do it, kind of thing. And that's like really satisfying, like that athlete's need for autonomy. Like, you know what you got to do. I'm not telling you what to do. You go do it because you know better than me. And then just like, get your together. You've got this. Just like, I believe in you. I stand behind you. Now just get your act together. You got this. And then just like, I believe in you. It's just like, here, again, you can just imagine the scenario of the coach like yelling at the top of his lungs and like pointing the finger in the athlete's face and just almost being quite scary. And like you mentioned, like some athletes might sit there and freeze and be like, oh my goodness. But like this athlete could actually be like, that's exactly what I need, coach. And you've just like perfectly, well, I mean, I can't imagine an athlete ever sitting there in the ring going, you've just satisfied my psychological needs. But really, these statements here, this statement here could be a great way to satisfy your athlete's psychological needs. So there's no template as to what you should say. It's all about, not about what you say, but more about considering the athlete's psychological needs when you say things to them. All right, what I want to do now, because I think we have a kind of an idea of like what psychological needs are, how we might satisfy them, how we might frustrate them. I'm aware of time and I really want to have a big chat at the end. So I'm just going to go through like an FAQ section briefly, some frequently asked questions in the past. And I'm assuming, I might be wrong, that some of you have questions down the line of this, and that's why I'm trying to answer them now to save time so we can spend more time chatting at the end. So first of all, some people have asked me, so is autonomy supportive just doing nothing? Pulling a lawn chair out, putting your feet up and saying, all right, athletes, go practice. You just knock yourself out. I'm just going to sit here and read a book and have a beer. No, that is not, it's not autonomy supportive. Autonomy supportive is a very ongoing thing between you and the athlete, between you and the team. Like I said before, it's you're providing rationale, you're providing options for the athletes, you're asking the athletes questions, the athletes asking you questions. It's a very ongoing environment. It's that there's a lot happening there. So it's not just yes, there might be a scenario where you say, you know what do you want to do today? And the athlete says, I want to do this. And then you stand there and say nothing and say, yeah, go for it. And you just observe. That can be autonomously supportive as well. But it's not you stand back and do nothing. You're still observing. You're still waiting to ask questions, and you're waiting for the athlete to ask questions to you. Silence does not mean bad, okay? Silence can actually be a very powerful tool because it allows athletes to take charge in what's going on. Is competence support the same as like this fake hype? Just like, you got this, you got this, you got this. Like I like using the example in team sports, whether it's like soccer or volleyball or whatever it might be, like, or basketball. Like you've got an athlete that's just like messing up and just making mistake after mistake after mistake. And you've got your teammates and your coach is just constantly yelling, you've got this, you've got this, you've got this, you've got this. And it goes on, and I could repeat it 5 more times, and I'm sure you'd feel the same way as that athlete. The first few times might be like, okay, thanks. But after like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times of me repeating the same mistake and you just going, you got this, that is not competence support. That is just some fake hype of you being like, don't worry about it. It's just, yeah, don't worry about it. Thanks. I'll try that next time. So competence support, actually what that looks like is like, hey, I believe you can do this, but here's how, right? So that's a combination of like competence support and autonomy support. Again, they're all interrelated. So just saying you got this isn't necessarily enough, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I just see the message from Margaret. You need to tell them how they can achieve it, what corrections to make. Absolutely, yeah. I don't know if that's related to this or something before, but that it applies here. So it's not just hype you up, but you can do this, and here's how. Now, my favorite, relatedness support. Is that just the same as being positive the whole time? We live in a day and age where, I don't know, maybe it's just me because this is my field of my area of interest and my area of research, but the amount of times I hear people just saying like, just smile, or just be positive, or just this, it's really annoying. And it's not supportive. Like, again, there might be a scenario where you say like, just, it's okay. And that's fine. That can be like, you just like sugarcoat something, and that can be fine. That can be really helpful. But there's just like, everything is sugarcoated, nothing is bad, and everything is just put a positive spin on it. That is not you being related, providing relatedness support. Sometimes providing relatedness support is about being honest, right? If we care for one another, if we care for our athlete, sometimes we have to be honest and say, look, you messed up. But you can provide relatedness support by being honest and saying like, look, you messed up, but that's okay. I'm not going to punish you. I'm not going to abandon you. I'm not going to kick you off just because you messed up. You messed up, not great, but it's okay. The world moves on. I still care for you. All right. So there's some, I think, some commonly asked questions about these 3 things, because sometimes we think that these 3 things are all just about things that they're not necessarily. I hope that makes sense. Okay, now moving on to needs frustration. I've had some people go, okay, needs frustration is, wait, I see there's a comment. Yeah, be mindful. Absolutely, be mindful. How can we correct this for the next time? Fantastic, thank you. So needs frustration. I spend a lot of time talking about needs support, and so people then go, okay, if I've frustrated my athlete's needs today. That's it. I'm so sorry. I'm awful as a coach. I've messed up. I better quit. Like, let's not that bad, really. We're human beings. We make mistakes. Like, just like for those of you who have kids, you've probably shouted at your kids before. You've probably done stuff to your kids that you're not proud of. Mistakes happen. It's okay. Like, we can't be perfect all the time. It's not possible. The best thing we can do is, if you frustrate the athlete's needs occasionally or once, is to recognize it's a mistake and try and make changes so that doesn't happen again. If it becomes a pattern and you make the mistake and go, oh, I made a mistake, but then you keep doing it over and over and over and over, it's no longer a mistake, it's who you are, okay? So make mistake, it's okay. Don't beat yourself up about it, recognize it and say, what can I do to change it? I keep like accidentally saying to my athletes, I care for you only if you do well. That's not great. But like, if you recognize that and say, hey, look, no, actually, that's not the way I feel, change it. That's okay. And occasionally just apologize. If you shout at an athlete in the heat of the moment because they made a mistake and you really frustrate their needs, apologize. The athletes are resilient. Athletes recognize that like coaches are human beings. And if you do something that's bad and you can own up to it and apologize, the athletes will give you a lot of credit for it. I can assure you of that from an athlete's perspective. But if you just pretend like it didn't happen, that's worse than recognizing it and apologizing. Okay. So long story short, you will frustrate your athletes' needs from time to time, and that's okay. Just take these steps to recognize it and try and change it and apologize if necessary, and it's fine. This is an important one because I've had some people go, well, I see this athlete that their needs are not because of what I'm doing, but just in general. I recognize a coach that has a successful athlete, but the coach is really brutal. And just like, based on what you're talking about, Simon, it seems like this coach just like constantly frustrates this athlete's psychological needs, but the athlete's doing well. So should I change it? Or is it the case of never change a winning team because things are going well, don't change it because you might do things bad? And here's where I go, look, an athlete is a human being. We look at the Olympics, like the case with the Russian figure skater. She, like the doping thing aside, she struggled that last round and came in, and the coaches were just like, well, that wasn't good enough. Why did you make that mistake? Like, that wasn't okay. Like, athletes are human beings. Sometimes we forget that and we just kind of treat them as like performance driven machines, but like an athlete is a human being. So just because the athlete is doing well does not mean it's okay to frustrate their psychological needs. And the reason for that is just look at the research that I showed you, right? Athletes who have their psychological needs frustrated have like poor, in quote, bad, quote unquote, motivation. They experience burnout, they experience other struggles, psychological needs, frustration. Look at athletes, how many athletes, and I'm sure for those of you who've been coaching for a while, I'm sure as soon as I say this, you go, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. How many athletes have you seen that have been really, really talented and you're like, this athlete could go far, but then you realize that the coach that they've been with is kind of like a needs frustrating coach, and then it's all the parents, not just the coach, but the parents, and then the athlete reaches legal age or doesn't get the support anymore from the governing bodies, and the athlete's like, I am never doing this again. I hated every second of it. That is what can happen if you frustrate their needs. They might be successful, but it doesn't mean that they don't hate every second of it, okay? So needs frustration is not okay. It's always about satisfying their needs, regardless of their performance, all right? Okay. So here's the homework that I want to give you, and I'm aware of time, so I'm going to try and move on a little bit because I want to leave time for questioning at the end. Is I want you to go back to your good versus bad example and rewrite it. It's not about good and bad, it's about needs supportive and needs frustrating, okay? So you wrote down some examples of what you considered good versus bad, and I want you to circle the different ones in relation to psychological needs. What you considered good is more needs supportive, and what kind of needs is it? Is it autonomy, competence, relatedness? Circle that. What is bad? Like, how is that frustrating the athlete's psychological needs? Which need is it frustrating? Maybe you put something that you consider bad and you go, actually, that's actually quite supportive. I just thought it was bad. Move it over to the good side. Whereas you think, oh, you know what? I thought this was actually quite good behavior. Well, actually, it's needs frustrating. So put it over there. So create a list of like your typical behaviors and list them based on needs supportive versus needs frustrating. Again, I would love to read it, but we're sadly short of time. So this is just a homework I'm giving you as a way for you to think about your behaviors day to day when you're coaching your athletes, and how do they align with psychological needs, and then kind of like put them under more needs supportive versus more needs frustrating. And that can allow you to reflect on that and then hopefully go away and say, well, let's try something different. Maybe you say everything I do is very supportive. In that case, fantastic. Keep up the good work. Okay. Okay, last thing on this point. What's important is that supportive versus controlling is not black and white. It's not always straightforward what's more supportive and what's less supportive. It's a spectrum, right? It's more supportive versus more controlling. And in between is like a dissatisfaction of psychological needs. If we look at what's good, bad, and in between, we'd say supportive, obviously, based on what I've spoken about, is what we strive for. And we want to steer away from controlling. That doesn't mean, and then dissatisfying sits in the middle here. So dissatisfaction of psychological needs falls like in between and the good versus bad debate. It's not great. Dissatisfaction isn't as good as like the outcomes that's related to supportive coaching. But on the other hand, it's nowhere near as bad as like controlling coaching. So there'll be moments where like you don't say anything to your athletes, and so you're not necessarily satisfying their needs, but you're not frustrating them, right? You're just not satisfying them, and that's okay. That's okay. There's nothing wrong. You don't have to constantly be satisfying their needs, because that's just it's impossible to do that. So it's okay to like dissatisfy them, because it's not associated with anything bad necessarily. Just again, you want to try and stay close to supportive as much as possible, and then you will veer across towards controlling occasion, but then move back to supportive again, right? And then the other thing is that like you can have a training session tomorrow, and you might be super supportive in the beginning, but then like later on, because of something, you might be more controlling. Just because I say that because it's not always your one or the other. You can adopt multiple types within one session. So that's something to be aware of. Okay, I want to take a quick pause here, just like 5 minutes. And then I want to go into the second point, which I promise won't take long. Well, actually, you know what? Scratch that. Because of time, I'm going to go to the second point now, which I promise will only take like 5 minutes. And then we can like open up the room for discussion. And I realize the time, but we started a bit late. So I hope that everyone's okay with that. Yeah. So what's the second important point that I learned? So the first one was it's more about the environment you create in relation to satisfying the psychological needs. And the second one is a coach who doesn't look after themselves is more likely to be controlling. So now it's time for you to look in the mirror. Because if you're not looking after yourself, you're more likely to be controlling. And here's 3 types of like factors that can influence whether you're more or less controlling or more supportive. The first one is like contextual factors. If you're under a lot of pressure, if you have job insecurity, you're more likely to be controlling. And I know a lot of that's out of your hands, and I can't necessarily offer any supportive advice in that front, but it's something to be aware of. If you're in an environment where you have opportunities to develop or you have job security, you're more likely to be need supportive. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. Then there's personal factors, which is your disposition. What is like your personality type as a coach? If you're somebody who's angry when they're tired, you're more likely to be controlling when you're tired. So again, something to be aware of. And then lastly, being aware of your perceiving your athlete's motivation. If your athlete's motivation is all about like, we don't care, we don't want to be here, you're more likely to be controlling. Whereas if the athlete's motivation is more intrinsically driven and like, oh, we want to learn, what can you teach us today, coach? You're more likely to be need supportive. So what can we do with this, right? What can you do with this information? Looking at contextual factors like pressures and opportunities for job development, I encourage you to try and reduce pressure where possible. Maybe it's a matter of cut back on your workload. That might be a way for you to try and like take some of the pressure off you personally. Does that maybe reduce some opportunities for development? I don't know. You know your work better, but if you can cut back on your day-to-day workload, chances are you might feel a bit more like weight lifted off you, and that can kind of help you be a bit more need supportive towards your athletes. I used the personal factor before. Let's say you're somebody who gets really angry when you're tired, and then you're like, I've got a training session tomorrow, I need to stay up all night and prep. Go to bed. Go to bed. Honestly, athletes, I'm saying this as an athlete here. When I was an athlete, I've had coaches come and train me that have been super exhausted, but they've had the most best sought out training plan. The training plan's brilliant, but they're super exhausted, so they're cranky. The athletes did not appreciate the effort that you put into your training plan. So you're better off going to bed and almost just like being honest and being like, okay, we're going to do something different tonight. We're going to wing it today because I needed to go to bed because I was exhausted. I can assure you that open and honesty with your athletes, they will appreciate it. So go to bed if you're tired, rather than forcing the issue and staying up late, because you're more likely to be controlling, which again, if you had to choose between controlling and knowledgeable versus supportive and less knowledgeable, I would choose supportive and less knowledgeable any day of the week as an athlete. Yeah, and then the final one is perceptions of athletes' motivation. Yeah, it sucks. I mean, my goodness, I have coached before, and when I have a group of 10 athletes in front of me, when I do these presentations and I have a group of 10 people in front of me that sit there and just pretend like and show zero interest, whew, that is tough. That is a very tough thing to get through. And so what I recognize, I recognize that is so easy to get mad, because I get mad at that as well when I'm doing presentations and no one cares. But just going the extra mile to be like extra supportive can really make a difference. Just try and get them out of that rut. Try and like recognize that, but like get them out of there, and then taking it from there. Yeah. Now I want to open up for questions. And what I'm going to do is here, I'm going to leave this slide open here. If you want to chat more, here's my email address. Here's my website, currently under construction. But you can email me and we can chat more. Or if you're on social media, I have an Instagram account. You can follow me on taylor.mindset and we can chat more. But that's my presentation. Thank you so much for listening. It has been, you have no idea how happy it makes me to talk about this stuff. And I'm going to stick around for 15, 20 minutes. To those of you who have questions and want to chat more. So thank you so much for listening. And yeah, let's chat. What questions might you have?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Simon. That was fantastic. And I didn't realize it was your first session as Dr. Simon Taylor. So that's awesome. We're so happy to hear from you. And this is great. This is super valuable. I was actually texting one of my coaches during the session because I just thought it was so great and applicable, and especially during this time too, especially the last point around it's important to take care of ourselves as coaches. Right now we're dealing with more than just coaching those sports specific things. We're dealing with managing facility rentals during a pandemic and things like that. So it's really an important reminder to take care of ourselves so that we can better take care of our athletes. So does anyone have any questions or maybe want to speak to any of the points that Simon brought up?
I've got a question. I'm just wondering, obviously all three psychological needs are important, but do you find or do you think that one is more important than the others?
Oh, wow. Okay, that is a great question, and a question that I don't think I have enough time to really dive into too deep. Generally speaking, depending on the situation, depending on the specific situation you're in, like if we assume, I'm going to use relatedness right now, okay? Let's say you have an athlete, a child athlete that's like 10 years old and has just had a nightmare of a day, just an absolute nightmare of a day. I think in that moment, all that matters is just like be there for the athlete, just look out for them and support their need and care for them. Is that the case for, like, let's say a 30-year-old athlete? Maybe not. Maybe for them, it's just being like, look, it's okay, you've got this, I believe in you, providing a sense of competence. But for like a younger athlete, it might be a need for relatedness. So again, the problem with these needs are they're all important, but it's, I hate to say it like this, but it's up to you to try and figure out what's most important in which situation. And again, it's trial and error. If you try something and it doesn't work and it backfires, recognize it and try something different in the future. But honestly, brilliant question. Thank you. I hope that answers it.
Yes, thanks very much.
Simon, I had a sort of maybe two-part question for you.
Sure.
The first one would be sort of upholding team standards, and when they're not, the standards aren't being met.
Yeah.
How can you still support those needs and maintain those standards?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because again, like that's why I had that FAQ section, because sometimes we feel like, oh, if this is just supporting the needs, I don't get to like speak out when something's going wrong. That's definitely not the case. So I think this, again, this relates to the relatedness component of it, is just like being honest with them and being like, hey, look, you're getting all this stuff. I care about you, but like, I need you to pull your weight a bit here. But it's not a pull your weight or else I don't like you because you're not pulling your weight. It's I care about you as people, but I really, it's your turn to kind of like, you're better than this, and you know you're better than this. And so trying to like showing them that you care, but also like being hard on them a bit. Does that help at all, or is that kind of not helpful there in that situation for you?
It does, and I think it also answers the next question I had, was sort of around deselection, but you want the athlete to continue to try out or be part of a team next year or next season. But I think you probably answered that as well.
I think it's in that situation, again, if you're satisfying these needs and you're giving them choices and you're like saying, look, I believe in you and like I care about you, and the athlete's just not reciprocating, I think maybe it's time to have a conversation with them and be like, what do you want? Like I'm basically giving everything that I think you need. But again, like have a conversation with the athlete, because you can almost like ask questions around like, what's missing? What do you want for me to feel more motivated or more inspired to try harder? And if they say, maybe they might be like, look, you're doing everything and I don't care that much. Okay, then thank you for sharing that with me. But you're no longer part of this performance program, which is okay. Sometimes athletes join these performance programs and they're not necessarily the right fit. You can do everything right and an athlete can not be motivated or not be interested. And we just need to recognize that at times. Yeah, but maybe it's you think you're doing everything right and then you ask the athlete and the athlete goes, you know what, you're not giving me enough options here. Or maybe you're not considering my schedule or whatever it might be. The athlete might sit down, the long story short, sit down with the athlete and ask the athlete, see what they think is missing, and if you can support that. And if it's just a matter of they just don't care, then you deselect them. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else got any questions? The beauty about these needs, and I'll mention that, it's like a double-edged sword. It's almost a nice thing about them, but it's also a really exhausting thing, is that the way we satisfy these needs can be very different in different scenarios. If you have time to chat to them in between breaks during a competition, you can like go through okay, like I believe in you, like what do you think you could do differently, and I'm here for you kind of thing, broadly speaking. But like if they're in the middle of a race and it's like timed and there's no timeouts or something, you might just have to like just shout at them and like maybe not be able to satisfy that need in that moment, because you just need to get across and you got to do what I say and that's it. But again, that doesn't mean just because you frustrated a need in that moment, or maybe it's not considered a frustrating of the need because the athlete recognizes, hey, coach doesn't have time to chat with me and give me everything I need, but that's okay. The important thing is that we satisfy these needs as much as we can in day-to-day life with the athletes. So when the moment comes that you maybe have to frustrate a need and just be like, look, I'm sick of you, you're not doing as you're told. You might have that moment. The athlete won't take it too personally, because the athlete will be like, oh, look, okay, wow, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe I need to look in the mirror here, because the coach you're always so great and supportive, but he's just like, they've lost their temper with me. So maybe I feel really like hurt by this, but maybe it gives the athlete an opportunity to reflect upon it and look in the mirror and say, what could I be doing differently? So there might be times when a frustrating of the athlete's needs is not the worst thing, but I say that very, very lightly, not as encouragement for you to go, okay, here's the green light for me to be mean to my athletes 24/7. We want to be supportive 24/7, and then there's an opportunity for the occasional slip here and there.
I gotta ask,
Yes.
I've been a lifelong poor but enthusiastic golfer. Do you still golf?
I still golf, yes. I am trying to, now that my PhD's done, my goal is to compete this year at the men's am and see how well I can do.
Excellent.
Yeah. I suppose just while I've got you here, one other thing I can share, I engaged in sports psychology. I did my master's and I did my PhD to kind of understand why did my game fall apart. And looking at the psychological needs, what I think happened, it's an explanation that I'm happy with, is that I honestly think, and this was no one's fault, and this kind of paints another picture that's something for you to consider, is I had a coach growing up who was my dad. I'm happy to admit that he was a brilliant coach and I loved him as a coach and I would change nothing. I was a very successful junior golfer, but my dad loved and cared for me so much that anytime I hit a golf shot that I didn't consider good enough, I was like, Dad, what's wrong? What's wrong? What's wrong? He just constantly was like, here's try this. My dad was brilliant. He supported me 24/7 in my golf game, to the point that when I got to the US and I was like, coach, what's wrong? He was like, it's fine, it's in play. I was so dependent that I had zero ability to play it freely. So basically, my dad didn't frustrate my need for autonomy, but he just didn't satisfy it, because I didn't allow him to satisfy that need because I was so dependent on him. And so I'm sharing that with you because you can do everything right as a coach. You can do everything that he wants you to do, and it can still backfire. Does that mean that my dad was a bad coach? No, absolutely not. He was a brilliant coach, but it wasn't until I left being coached by him that I realized I don't know how to play golf alone. And it took me 5 to 10 years of playing golf without my dad as a coach to develop that independence and that freedom and that autonomy that hadn't been given to me because I was so needy, if you will. So there's another very good example of how this, like, it's not black and white. It's a very gray area, and it's a very tough thing to do at times. But I hope that by sharing that personal story with you, you can realize that, okay, this is tough, and it's not easy. Yeah.
All right, thanks for sharing, Simon. And if there's any last questions, please ask now. Great, we're getting a couple thank yous in the chat box. Quickly before everyone leaves, I just want to review the upcoming PD sessions. So in March, we have International Women's Day on March 8th. So we have lots of female-focused professional development. So on March 5th, we're hosting a free virtual conference on female sport leadership. So if you want more information, feel free to email me or check out our MailChimp, like our monthly newsletter. There's tons of information in there, but it's online in the morning of March 5th. For our next podium performance sessions, again, for the month of March, we're doing mostly female specific professional development. So we have Emma Delory talking on March 10th about how she is doing 2 different ways of empowering female leaders. She's doing a lot for her sport in rugby right now, specifically with athletes and also with female coaches, and starting to develop more female coaches in her sport. So really encourage you guys to attend that. And on March 23rd, we're going to be hearing from another female ambassador with Baseball Newfoundland. So Kristen Colley, talk about empowering girls in sport. And then in April, which isn't too far away, Andrew will be from CSCA. He's our new coaching lead, specifically with equity, diversity, inclusion, and mentorship. We'll be speaking about 2 things that he's learned about creating an inclusive sport environment. And lastly, in April, we have our Coaching with an Edge conference. This will be our first in-person event for the first time in over 2 years. So we're really excited, and we really hope everyone can join. We are also offering it virtual, but in person you will receive more. You'll actually receive a little gift for attending and food, and be able to network for like the first time in a couple of years amongst sports other than the one you coach. So the link there for registration is on that graphic, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. And here's a brief view of our lineup, and we have a ton of presenters coming for this April. So looking forward to that. And again, if you have any questions, I'll be following up with an email, so you can just reply to that, and hopefully we'll see you in person in April. So thank you everyone for attending, and thanks again, Simon. That was fantastic. And I see a few more thanks coming in through the chat box. So thanks again, Doctor. And everyone, hope to see you on our next podium performance in 2 weeks. Thank you.